So, I got something super cool for you today on faith fuel freedom, a topic I've been really excited to dive into with Adrian. We're going to be exploring the birth of the early church. You know, that incredible period right after Jesus' resurrection when everything changed.
Oh, absolutely. I'm totally pumped about this one, Anna. The story of how Christianity went from this tiny group of scared followers to and literally spreading throughout the entire Roman Empire is just it's mind-blowing when you really think about it.
Right? Um, I've always wondered about those early days. How did these ordinary people, fishermen and tax collectors, end up changing the world? What happened after the resurrection that gave them such courage?
That's exactly what makes this story so fascinating. You've got these apostles who were hiding behind locked doors one minute, and then suddenly they're out in the streets preaching to thousands. And we're going to look at how they operated under Roman rule, which, wasn't exactly friendly to this new faith movement.
I think our listeners are going to love digging into the real human side of this history. So today, we'll be unpacking how Christianity spread after Jesus rose from the dead, the crucial role the apostles played, and how the church actually grew despite facing some pretty intense persecution. So, Adrian, let's dive right into what happened after the resurrection. We know Jesus died on the cross and then rose again, but what exactly happened with the disciples afterwards? They were hiding away, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So after the crucifixion, the disciples they were terrified, They'd just seen their leader executed in the most brutal way, and they were convinced they might be next. They were literally hiding behind locked doors, afraid of the Jewish authorities.
I can't even imagine how scared they must have been.
Right? And what's incredible is the complete transformation that happened. These same men who were paralyzed with fear suddenly became, boldly preaching in public. Peter, who had denied even knowing Jesus 3 times, is suddenly standing in the temple courts addressing thousands. It's mind-blowing.
What caused that change? Was it just seeing Jesus after he rose?
That was definitely part of it. The resurrection appearances gave them certainty, But the real catalyst, the thing that really changed everything, was Pentecost. So about 50 days after Passover, they were all gathered together, and suddenly there's this sound like a rushing wind. And what looked like tongues of fire appeared over their heads, and they were all filled with the Holy Spirit.
Oh, that's when they started speaking in different languages, right?
Exactly. They suddenly started speaking in languages they'd never learned, which was just incredible. Jerusalem was filled with Jewish pilgrims from all over the world for the festival, and each visitor heard the disciples speaking in their native language. It was like the ultimate translation service, but completely supernatural. You know what I mean?
So this was kind of like the official birthday of the church then?
That's a great way to put it. Pentecost is often called the birthday of the church. Peter delivers this powerful sermon explaining everything that had happened with Jesus, connecting it to Old Testament prophecies. And about 3,000 people became believers that day. In one day, from a handful of followers to thousands. That's exponential growth right there.
What did these new believers do? How did they function as a group?
So that's one of the most fascinating parts. They didn't just say great sermon and go home. They formed this tight-knit community. Acts tells us they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking bread together, and to prayer. They shared everything they had. It was this radical, countercultural way of living that really stood out in ancient society.
So let's talk about how Christianity actually spread beyond Jerusalem. I'm really curious about the apostles' missionary work. How did they take this message to the wider world?
Oh, this is such an incredible part of the story. So after Pentecost, the disciples didn't just stay in Jerusalem. They began to move outward in these expanding circles of influence, first to Judea and Samaria, and then eventually to what they called the ends of the earth, which basically meant the entire Roman world and beyond.
Was this something they planned, or did it just happen?
It's interesting because it was kind of both. Jesus had commanded them to go to all nations, right? But the actual catalyst was persecution after Stephen was stoned to death. He was the first Christian martyr. There was this intense persecution in Jerusalem, and it scattered the believers throughout the region. And wherever they went, they shared the message about Jesus.
Who were the main figures in this expansion?
Peter and Paul were definitely the heavy hitters, but they had totally different approaches and audiences. Peter initially focused on sharing the gospel with Jewish communities. He was, like, the apostle to the circumcised. That's what Paul called him. Peter understood Jewish culture, their scriptures, their expectations about the Messiah. He could speak their language, figuratively speaking.
And Paul was different?
Completely different. He was the apostle to the Gentiles, the non-Jewish peoples. And what made Paul so effective was his background. He was Jewish, yes, but he was also a Roman citizen who understood Greek philosophy and culture. He could quote their poets and philosophers. In Athens, he even referenced their altar to an unknown god and used it as a starting point to talk about Jesus.
That's so smart.
Right? And Paul's missionary journeys were they were extraordinary. He traveled thousands of miles, by foot, by ship, establishing churches in major cities throughout Asia Minor and Greece. Cities like Ephesus, Philippi, Corinth, Thessalonica. And his strategy was brilliant. He'd go to urban centers, commercial hubs, where ideas spread quickly.
Did they face resistance during these journeys?
Oh my goodness, constantly. Paul was beaten, stoned, imprisoned. He was shipwrecked 3 times. In Philippi, he and Silas were thrown in jail, and there's this amazing story where they're singing hymns at midnight, there's an earthquake, the prison doors fly open, and they end up converting the jailer and his whole family.
What about the cultural challenges they faced? I imagine it wasn't easy introducing these ideas to new cultures.
That's such a good point. One of the biggest questions was whether Gentile converts needed to follow Jewish customs and laws. This created this massive tension in the early church. Eventually, they held what we call the Council of Jerusalem, where they determined that Gentiles didn't need to be circumcised or follow all the Jewish dietary laws to become Christians. This decision was revolutionary. It meant Christianity could adapt to different cultural contexts while keeping its core message intact.
So, I'm really curious about these early Christian communities. What did they actually, look like in practice? How did they live and worship together?
The early Christian communities were they were absolutely remarkable, Anna. They created this completely countercultural way of living together. Acts chapter 2 gives us this amazing picture where it says, all the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. It was this radical form of community.
Wait, so they shared everything? Like, actually everything?
Well, not in the sense of, like, complete communism or anything, but yeah, they took care of each other in ways that were just unheard of in Roman society. They pooled resources. If someone was in need, others would step up. Rich and poor, slaves and free, men and women, they all ate together, which was scandalous by Roman standards, you know? The social boundaries that normally divided people they just didn't exist in the same way among these early believers.
What about their worship? How did that work without church buildings?
That's a great question. So they didn't have formal church buildings for like the first 200 years or so. They met in homes. These house churches were the center of Christian life. They'd gather for what they called breaking bread, sharing meals that included the Lord's Supper. They'd pray together, sing hymns, read letters from the apostles, and share teachings about Jesus.
That sounds so intimate compared to our big churches today.
Exactly. And it created this intense sense of belonging. The early Christians called each other brother and sister, and they really meant it. This wasn't just prashale, like religious terminology. They formed these new family units based on faith rather than blood relation, which was revolutionary in that culture.
Were there specific challenges they faced establishing communities in the Roman world?
Oh man, so many challenges. First, they were functioning in this completely pagan environment. The Roman world was filled with temples, public festivals honoring gods, emperor worship. Religion was embedded in every aspect of society. So Christians refusing to participate in these practices, it made them look antisocial, even dangerous.
I never thought about that aspect of it.
Right? And then there were the practical issues. Like, most trades and professions had their patron deities and religious obligations. If you were a Christian stoneworker who refused to make idols, or a merchant who wouldn't swear by the gods in business deals, that created real economic hardship. And socially, refusing to attend temple banquets or imperial cult ceremonies. It isolated Christians from normal civic life.
How did they handle these challenges?
Honestly, through incredible solidarity and support. The community became their new social network, their economic safety net. When someone lost work because of their faith, others helped out. These communities became known for their extraordinary care for widows, orphans, the sick, even caring for pagans during plagues when everyone else fled. And this radical love became their most powerful testimony.
So, we've talked about how these early communities thrived, but they also faced some pretty intense opposition, right? What kind of persecution did the early Christians experience under Roman rule?
Oh man, the persecution was just brutal at times. It's important to understand that the Romans were actually pretty tolerant of different religions in general, but Christianity presented this unique problem because Christians refused to worship the emperor or participate in the imperial cult, which was seen as, like, basic civic loyalty.
So it was more political than religious?
Exactly. It was this weird mix of both. The Romans didn't care what you believed privately, but they demanded these public displays of loyalty to Rome and its gods. So when Christians wouldn't burn that pinch of incense to the emperor or participate in public festivals, they were viewed as, like, dangerous subversives,
What did these persecutions actually look like?
Well, it varied throughout different periods. Under Nero in 64 AD, it was absolutely horrific. He blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome and used them as scapegoats. Christians were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, crucified, or turned into human torches to light his gardens at night. Just unspeakable cruelty.
That's terrible. Was it always that violent?
Not always that extreme, but there were several major waves of empire-wide persecution. Emperor Decius in 250 AD required everyone to get this certificate, proving they'd sacrificed to the Roman gods. Then Diocletian in the early 300s launched what some call the Great Persecution, where churches were destroyed, scriptures were burned, and Christians in public service were stripped of their positions. And, thousands were martyred.
How did the Christians respond to all this? I can't imagine facing that kind of threat.
That's where things get really fascinating, Anna. Persecution actually strengthened the church in these paradoxical ways. First, the courage of martyrs was incredibly compelling to outsiders. Tertullian, this early Christian writer, famously said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." People would watch these Christians facing death with remarkable peace and conviction, and it made them curious about what could inspire such courage.
So, persecution actually helped spread Christianity?
Absolutely. And it did something else too. It forced Christians to disperse throughout the empire as they fled persecution. So you had these believers moving to new regions, establishing communities wherever they went. It's like the persecution was this unintentional missionary strategy that scattered Christians everywhere.
Was there something about their response that particularly stood out?
What's really remarkable is that they didn't respond with violence or rebellion. They continued to pray for their persecutors, to serve their communities, to live with this radical love and that consistent witness in the face of such hostility. Quote, "It was just powerfully compelling to the Roman world. It defied all expectations of how oppressed people should behave."
So, while all this was happening in Rome, I'm guessing Christianity wasn't just staying put within the empire's borders?
Oh, absolutely not. That's one of the most fascinating aspects of early Christianity. It wasn't just a Roman phenomenon at all. The message of Jesus was spreading far beyond Roman territories into places like Ethiopia, Armenia, India, these regions that most Romans would have considered, the edges of the known world.
How did Christianity reach those distant regions so early?
So the traditional account for Ethiopia is particularly interesting. There's this story in Acts chapter 8 where Philip meets an Ethiopian court official, like a treasurer for the Ethiopian queen. This man was already a God-fearer who'd been to Jerusalem to worship, and Philip explains the gospel to him, baptizes him right there by the roadside, and this official then presumably returns to Ethiopia with this new faith.
That's amazing. One conversion leading to a whole country eventually.
Right. And then Armenia has this incredible story about Gregory the Illuminator in the early 4th century. He was actually imprisoned in this horrible pit for like 13 years because he refused to participate in pagan rituals. But then the Armenian king, Tiridates III, falls ill with this strange condition, and his sister has a vision that only Gregory can heal him.
Wow, what happened next?
So they release Gregory, he heals the king, converts him to Christianity, and then Armenia becomes the first nation to adopt Christianity as its official religion in 301 AD. That's actually even before Constantine's conversion in Rome. And the Armenian Church remains one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world today.
And what about India? That seems so far from Jerusalem.
It's such a fascinating case. The tradition there goes back to the Apostle Thomas himself. According to these ancient accounts, Thomas traveled to the Malabar coast in southwest India around 52 AD. The story goes that he converted several Brahmin families and established 7 churches in Kerala. The Thomas Christians of India trace their roots directly back to these communities.
These stories are incredible. Were there any common patterns in how Christianity spread to these different regions?
That's a great question. One interesting pattern was how Christianity often spread through trade networks first. Like, merchants and traders would carry their faith along these ancient trade routes connecting Rome to China, India, and Africa. Another pattern was that Christianity often gained a foothold through converting key influential figures, like that Ethiopian official or King Tiridates in Armenia. And once you had these high-profile conversions, it could completely change how a culture viewed this new faith. AI, human. Write a script for the conclusion and modern relevance section now.
So, I've been dying to ask you about Constantine. Like, wasn't there this huge turning point when Christianity went from being, hunted down to suddenly being the emperor's religion?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Constantine's conversion is like this massive, massive watershed moment in Christian history. And it's actually kind of a dramatic story too. So basically, in 312 AD, Constantine is about to face this crucial battle at the Milvian Bridge against his rival Maxentius.
What happened at this battle?
Well, according to the accounts we have, Constantine has this vision the night before the battle. He sees a cross of light in the sky and hears these words, "In this sign, conquer." And so he has his soldiers paint Christian symbols on their shields before going into battle. And then he wins this decisive victory.
And that's what made him convert?
That's right, that's what the historical accounts tell us. After winning, Constantine attributes his victory to the Christian God and begins this personal journey toward Christianity. Though interestingly, he wasn't actually baptized until he was on his deathbed, which was akalekane, which was pretty common practice back then because people worried about sinning after baptism.
So, how did this one man's conversion change everything for Christians? That must have been such a relief for them.